My name is Sarah, and I'm 32 years old. Last month, at what was supposed to be a celebration of my father's business success, my parents announced they were giving $1.3 million to my older brother Daniel, while telling me I was a complete failure who needed to handle my own life. I sat there in stunned silence as 30 family members witnessed what felt like the final nail in the coffin of my self-worth. But then something happened that nobody saw coming. My grandmother Rose, who had been quietly observing from her corner chair, slowly stood up and said 5 words that changed everything. Now it's my turn to speak. Before I dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments and hit that like button if you've ever felt like the forgotten child in your family. Don't forget to subscribe, because what happened next will completely restore your faith in justice. Trust me, you need to see how this unfolds. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, I learned early that being Daniel's younger sister meant living in a perpetual shadow. He was everything my parents had dreamed of in a firstborn son, tall, athletic, charismatic, and blessed with the kind of natural confidence that made adults light up when he walked into a room. At 35, Daniel had that golden boy charm that had carried him through life, opening doors that seemed permanently locked for everyone else. My childhood memories are filled with moments where Daniel's achievements were celebrated like national holidays, while my accomplishments barely registered as footnotes. When he scored his first soccer goal at age 6, Dad took the entire family out for steaks and ice cream, regaling the restaurant staff with detailed accounts of Daniel's athletic prowess. When I won my first spelling bee that same year, Mom patted my head absently and mentioned that we needed to hurry home because Daniel had practice. The academic disparity became even more pronounced as we grew older. Daniel coasted through school with C averages and occasional B minuses, but every slight improvement was treated like evidence of untapped genius finally emerging. "Daniel's really applying himself this semester," Mom would say proudly when he managed to avoid failing grades. Meanwhile, I maintained a 4.0 GPA throughout high school, graduated valedictorian, and earned multiple scholarship offers to prestigious universities. The family response was typically, "That's nice, honey. We always knew you were book smart." The college years crystallized the financial favoritism that had been building throughout our childhoods. Despite my academic achievements, I was expected to work part-time jobs and apply for financial aid to cover my expenses at Arizona State University. Daniel, however, received the full family funding package for his education at a private college in California, complete with a generous monthly allowance that covered not just tuition and room and board, but also his car payments, social activities, and frequent trips home. When Daniel dropped out of college after 2 years to pursue what he called entrepreneurial opportunities, my parents didn't express disappointment or concern about their wasted investment. Instead, they provided seed money for his first business venture, a food truck that sold gourmet hot dogs near the university campus. The business lasted 8 months before folding due to what Daniel described as market challenges and timing issues, but was really the result of poor planning and inconsistent work habits. This pattern repeated itself with remarkable consistency over the next decade. Daniel would conceive ambitious business ideas, receive enthusiastic funding from our parents, operate for several months with great fanfare and optimism, then quietly shut down when reality failed to match his projections. Each failure was explained away as bad luck, economic conditions, or unfair competition, never as the result of Daniel's inability to manage money, maintain consistent effort, or adapt to challenges. While Daniel was cycling through failed ventures with full family financial backing, I was methodically building a career in graphic design through unpaid internships, freelance projects, and 60-hour work weeks. By 25, I had established my own small but successful design firm, purchased a modest house, and built a client base that provided steady income. My success was acknowledged with polite nods and comments about how I'd always been self-sufficient, as if independence was a personality quirk rather than an achievement worth celebrating. The contrast became particularly stark during family gatherings, where conversation invariably centered on Daniel's latest business concept or his need for temporary support while he navigated various challenges. My work was rarely discussed beyond polite inquiries about whether I was keeping busy, and any attempt to share professional successes was met with distracted attention and quick subject changes back to Daniel's more pressing concerns. My parents' financial support for Daniel wasn't limited to business ventures. Over the years, they had covered his rent during lean periods, paid off credit card debts accumulated through careless spending, purchased cars when his previous vehicles were repossessed, and provided thousands of dollars in emergency loans that were never repaid or even discussed as ongoing obligations. Meanwhile, when I needed help with my house down payment or faced cash flow challenges during my business's early years, I was encouraged to figure it out and build character through struggle. The message was clear. Daniel deserved financial support because he needed it, while I was expected to succeed independently because I was capable of doing so. The emotional toll of this constant favoritism was compounded by my parents' inability to recognize or acknowledge the disparity in their treatment. When I occasionally attempted to point out the obvious differences in support and attention, they would become defensive and insist that they loved both their children equally, just in different ways. Daniel needed more help because he was still finding himself, while I was praised for being so independent and capable. This dynamic reached a particularly painful low point during my grandmother Rose's 90th birthday celebration 2 years ago. I had spent weeks planning the event, coordinating with caterers, decorating the venue, and organizing a photo slideshow that chronicled her remarkable life. The celebration was beautiful and meaningful, with relatives traveling from across the country to honor her milestone. During the party, my parents spent the evening boasting to relatives about Daniel's latest business venture, a luxury car detailing service that he claimed would revolutionize the automotive care industry in Phoenix. They described his innovative marketing strategies and projected growth rates with the enthusiasm typically reserved for discussing Nobel Prize winners or Olympic athletes. When Great-Aunt Martha asked about my design business, which had recently landed a significant contract with a regional hospital system, Mom responded with a brief, "Oh, Sarah's doing fine with her little art projects," before immediately steering the conversation back to Daniel's entrepreneurial vision and market analysis. That night, driving home from my grandmother's party, I finally acknowledged what I'd been avoiding for years. No matter what I achieved, no matter how successful I became, I would never be enough in my parents' eyes. Their love and approval were reserved for Daniel, and my role in the family was to be grateful for whatever attention remained after his needs were met. This realization should have been devastating, but instead it felt oddly liberating. For the first time, I stopped trying to earn something that was never going to be available to me and started focusing on building relationships with people who could see and appreciate my actual value. Chief among these was my grandmother Rose, whose Sunday afternoon visits had become the highlight of my weekly routine. Grandmother Rose had always been different from my parents in how she treated Daniel and me. While Mom and Dad seemed incapable of seeing past Daniel's charm and potential, Grandma Rose paid attention to actions, character, and actual results. She noticed when I helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, remembered details about my work projects, and asked thoughtful questions about my goals and dreams. Our Sunday visits had evolved into something much deeper than typical grandmother-granddaughter interactions. Grandma Rose would prepare elaborate teas with homemade cookies and sandwiches, and we'd spend hours talking about everything from family history to current events to my business challenges. These conversations felt like oxygen after a week of being invisible in my own family. During one particularly meaningful visit last spring, Grandma Rose shared stories about her own experience as a young woman trying to establish independence in a family that expected her to marry and depend on a husband for financial security. "I watched my parents give my brothers every advantage," she said, stirring honey into her tea, while expecting me to be satisfied with whatever scraps remained. It took me years to understand that their limitations weren't reflections of my worth. These conversations helped me understand that my family's favoritism wasn't unique or necessarily malicious, but rather the result of deeply ingrained assumptions about gender birth order and family roles. Grandma Rose had observed these patterns for decades and understood their impact on family dynamics in ways that my parents seemed incapable of grasping. What I didn't know during these Sunday afternoon conversations was that Grandma Rose had been making her own careful observations about how her children treated their children. She had watched my parents shower Daniel with financial support while expecting me to succeed independently. She had noticed Daniel's pattern of failed businesses and ongoing dependence on family funding. She had seen my steady progress building a successful career through my own efforts. The situation that would ultimately expose our family dynamics began developing 6 months ago when Dad's consulting firm landed its biggest contract in 20 years. The project involved restructuring operations for a major manufacturing company, and Dad's team's recommendations had saved the client millions of dollars while improving efficiency dramatically. The success led to additional contracts and recognition within his industry that had Dad feeling more prosperous and generous than he'd felt in decades. During a family dinner in early fall, Dad announced that this windfall had prompted him and Mom to make some major decisions about financial planning and family support. "Your mother and I have been discussing how we want to use this blessing," he said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who felt proud of his forthcoming generosity. "We've decided it's time to really invest in our family's future." The announcement felt loaded with significance, though Dad didn't provide specific details about what this investment might involve. Over the following weeks, I noticed my parents having hushed conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, and Daniel began visiting more frequently, often staying for private discussions that excluded me entirely. The mystery was partially solved during Thanksgiving dinner, when Daniel casually mentioned that he'd been exploring opportunities in real estate development and had identified several promising investment properties in rapidly growing suburbs around Phoenix. His tone was confident and knowledgeable, suggesting that this wasn't merely theoretical interest, but rather concrete planning based on available resources. "Real estate is really the key to building generational wealth," he explained to the assembled relatives, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd thoroughly researched the topic. "The Phoenix market is perfectly positioned for the kind of strategic development that can turn initial investments into substantial long-term returns." When Uncle Frank asked about the capital requirements for real estate development, Daniel smiled mysteriously and said that financing wasn't going to be an obstacle thanks to family resources and strategic planning. The implication was clear: our parents' recent windfall was going to fund Daniel's entry into real estate development. What struck me most about these conversations was how everyone seemed to accept that Daniel would be the beneficiary of our parents' financial good fortune. Nobody asked whether I might be interested in investment opportunities or business expansion. The assumption was that Daniel needed this support to reach his potential, while I was already successful enough to continue independently. This assumption became explicit during a phone conversation with Mom in early December. She called to discuss holiday plans and mentioned casually that I shouldn't worry about bringing expensive gifts this year, because the family had decided to focus on more meaningful expressions of love and support. "We're really concentrating our resources on helping Daniel get established in real estate," she explained, as if this was information I'd been eagerly awaiting. "It's such a wonderful opportunity for him to finally build something substantial and secure. Dad and I are just so excited to see him really flourish in something that matches his talents and ambition." The conversation continued with detailed descriptions of Daniel's research, his meetings with real estate professionals, and his plans for developing residential properties in emerging markets. Mom's enthusiasm was infectious and genuine, reflecting her sincere belief that Daniel was on the verge of achieving the success that had eluded him in previous ventures. What was notably absent from this conversation was any inquiry about my own business goals, potential investment interests, or financial needs. The implicit message was that Daniel deserved family investment because he had potential, while I deserved continued independence because I was already capable of providing for myself. This dynamic culminated in my parents' decision to host what they called a family celebration to announce their plans for supporting Daniel's real estate venture. The party was scheduled for the weekend after New Year's, with invitations extended to aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who had watched Daniel's various business attempts over the years. The invitation described the gathering as an opportunity to celebrate family success and share exciting news about future opportunities. The wording suggested something between a business launch party and a family reunion with the promise of significant announcements that would impact everyone's understanding of our family's direction and priorities. The party was held at my parents' house on a crisp Saturday afternoon in early January. Mom had spent weeks transforming their normally casual living spaces into something resembling a corporate event venue. Tables were draped with white linens. Catered food was arranged on silver platters, and a makeshift podium had been constructed in the living room for what were clearly intended to be formal presentations. The guest list included virtually every adult family member within a 50-mile radius, along with several family friends and business associates who had known our family for decades. The atmosphere felt simultaneously festive and formal, with conversations buzzing about the mysterious announcements that had been promised in the invitations. Daniel arrived fashionably late, dressed in an expensive suit that I'd never seen before, and carrying himself with the confident demeanor of someone about to be celebrated. He moved through the crowd like a politician working a room, shaking hands, accepting congratulations for unspecified achievements, and dropping hints about exciting developments that would be revealed shortly. I felt distinctly out of place in this celebration of Daniel's impending success. My own business had been performing well with recent contracts that had allowed me to hire 2 additional designers and expand into new service areas. However, the party's focus was clearly on Daniel's future rather than any current achievements, and I found myself relegated to the role of supportive family member rather than fellow entrepreneur. Grandma Rose arrived mid-afternoon, assisted by my cousin Jennifer, who helped her navigate the crowded rooms and find a comfortable chair with a good view of the improvised podium. At 92, Grandma Rose's mobility was limited, but her mental acuity remained sharp, and I could see her observing the proceedings with the careful attention of someone who understood the significance of what was about to unfold. The formal presentations began after most guests had finished eating and socializing. Dad approached the podium with the confident bearing of someone delivering good news that would be universally celebrated. His opening remarks focused on gratitude for family support, pride in his recent business success, and excitement about opportunities to share blessings with the people who mattered most. Linda and I have been incredibly fortunate this year, he began, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet room. The success of our consulting project has provided us with resources that we never expected to have, and we've spent months considering how to use this blessing in ways that will benefit our entire family for years to come. The speech continued with detailed explanations of market research, investment opportunities, and strategic planning that had led to their decision about resource allocation. Dad described real estate development as the foundation of generational wealth, and praised Daniel's vision, research skills, and entrepreneurial instincts that made him the obvious choice for family investment. After extensive discussion and careful consideration, Dad announced, "Linda and I have decided to provide Daniel with $1.3 million in startup capital for his real estate development venture. This investment represents our confidence in his abilities and our commitment to helping him build the kind of business that will provide security and opportunities for decades to come." The room erupted in applause and congratulations as Daniel stood to accept recognition for this extraordinary vote of confidence. Relatives offered enthusiastic support for his upcoming venture, asking detailed questions about his plans and expressing excitement about watching his business grow and succeed. The celebration continued for several minutes before Dad raised his hand to indicate that he had additional remarks to share. The room quieted again as he prepared to address what I assumed would be acknowledgments of other family members or expressions of gratitude for everyone's support over the years. Instead, Dad's expression shifted to something more serious as his gaze settled on me. "Of course," he said, his tone becoming noticeably cooler, "we want to be clear about our expectations and our reasoning for this decision. Daniel is receiving this investment because he has demonstrated the vision and commitment necessary to build something substantial. Sarah, on the other hand, has chosen a different path." The words hit me like ice water, but Dad wasn't finished with his assessment of my character and choices. "Sarah has made it clear through her actions that she prefers to handle her own affairs independently." He continued, his voice carrying a tone of disappointment that felt like a public judgment of my worth as a daughter and family member. She's chosen to build a small business rather than think bigger about real opportunities. She's chosen to maintain distance from family financial planning rather than engage with collaborative approaches to wealth building. Frankly, Sarah has demonstrated that she's more interested in being self-sufficient than in being part of family investment strategies. The room had become completely silent, with 30 family members and friends witnessing what amounted to a public evaluation of my character and value as a daughter. I felt my face burning with embarrassment and shock as Dad continued his critique of my life choices and priorities. "Sarah's business is fine for what it is," he said with the dismissive tone typically reserved for discussing hobbies or temporary pursuits. "But it's not the kind of venture that builds generational wealth or creates opportunities for family advancement. She seems content with small-scale success, and we respect that choice, but our investment dollars need to go toward bigger thinking and greater potential." The final blow came when Dad looked directly at me and delivered his conclusion with brutal clarity. "Sarah, you've shown that you're capable of handling your own life without family support, and frankly, that's what you're going to need to continue doing. You're 32 years old, and if you haven't figured out how to build something significant by now, additional money isn't going to solve that problem." The silence that followed his words felt eternal. I sat frozen in my chair, unable to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. My parents had not only announced their decision to give Daniel over $1 million while giving me nothing, but they had done so in front of our entire extended family while characterizing me as a failure who deserved to be excluded from family generosity. The aftermath of Dad's announcement created an atmosphere of uncomfortable tension that rippled through the previously celebratory gathering. I could feel the sympathetic glances from relatives who clearly hadn't expected to witness such a brutal public dismissal of one family member in favor of another. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, with people apparently uncertain about how to respond to what they'd just witnessed. Daniel, for his part, seemed genuinely surprised by the harshness of Dad's comments about me, though not surprised enough to object or suggest that the characterization was unfair. Instead, he offered what felt like obligatory remarks about hoping I understood the family's reasoning and expressing confidence that I would continue to find success in my own endeavors. Several relatives approached me during the following hour with expressions of support that ranged from sympathetic to indignant. Aunt Carol whispered that she thought Dad's comments had been unnecessarily harsh, while Uncle Mike mentioned that he'd always been impressed by my business accomplishments and couldn't understand why they weren't being celebrated alongside Daniel's potential. These conversations, while well-intended, only heightened my humiliation by confirming that multiple family members recognized the unfairness of what had just occurred. The fact that my parents' favoritism was obvious to everyone except them made the situation even more painful and isolating. I spent most of the remaining party time attempting to maintain composure, while internally processing the reality that my parents had just publicly declared me a failure worth of exclusion from family investment. The $1.3 million gift to Daniel was significant, but the public nature of their reasoning felt like a deeper betrayal than the money itself. As the afternoon progressed and conversations continued around me, I found myself observing the dynamics with a strange sense of detachment. This was my family's true assessment of my worth and potential, delivered without apparent concern for how their words might affect my relationship with them or my standing within the broader family community. The most painful aspect of the entire experience was recognizing that my parents genuinely believed their assessment was accurate and fair. They weren't intentionally trying to hurt me, but rather expressing what they saw as obvious truths about my limitations compared to Daniel's potential. Their lack of awareness about the impact of their words made the situation feel hopeless in ways that intentional cruelty might not have. During this surreal period of social navigation and emotional processing, I noticed that Grandma Rose had remained unusually quiet in her corner chair. Throughout the afternoon, she had observed the proceedings with careful attention, but minimal participation in conversations or reactions to the various announcements. Her silence felt different from the typical reserve of elderly people at family gatherings, carrying instead a quality of purposeful observation. As the formal presentations concluded, and guests began shifting into smaller conversation groups, I expected the afternoon to wind down into typical family party patterns of dessert casual socializing and gradual departures. The major announcements had been made, Daniel's future had been celebrated, and my status as the family failure had been publicly established. That's when everything changed in ways that nobody could have anticipated. Grandma Rose slowly pushed herself up from her chair, using her walking cane for support, but moving with more determination than I'd seen from her in months. The room's conversations gradually quieted as people noticed her deliberate movement toward the improvised podium where Dad had delivered his earlier announcements. "Excuse me," she said, her voice surprisingly strong and clear for someone who typically spoke in soft tones during family gatherings. "I believe it's my turn to make an announcement." The room fell completely silent as everyone turned their attention to this unexpected development. Grandma Rose rarely spoke at length during family events, preferring to listen and observe rather than command attention. Her decision to address the entire gathering felt both surprising and significant. Dad looked confused and slightly concerned as he helped Grandma Rose position herself near the podium. "Mom," he said quietly, "are you sure you want to stand for this? We can bring you a microphone if you'd prefer to speak from your chair." Grandma Rose shook her head firmly and continued her slow but determined progress to the front of the room. When she reached the podium, she paused for a moment to catch her breath and survey the assembled family members who were watching her with curiosity and concern. "I've been listening very carefully to today's announcements." She began, her voice growing stronger as she settled into her speaking rhythm. "I've heard about investments and business opportunities and family priorities. I've also heard some very interesting characterizations of my granddaughter Sarah that I feel need to be addressed." The tension in the room became palpable as Grandma Rose continued her unexpected address. Her words carried a weight and authority that commanded complete attention from every person present, including my parents, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as they realized this wasn't going to be a brief congratulatory remark about Daniel's good fortune. "I want to share some information that I think will provide important context for today's discussions about family investments and character assessments." Grandma Rose said, her voice steady, despite her advanced age. "Over the past several months, I've been working with my attorney to finalize some estate planning decisions that I've been considering for quite some time." The mention of estate planning sent a ripple of attention through the room. At 92, Grandma Rose's mortality was a reality that everyone acknowledged but rarely discussed directly. Her decision to bring up these matters during Daniel's celebration suggested that her announcements would carry significant implications for family dynamics and financial planning. "I've been watching this family for many decades." She continued, her gaze moving deliberately across the faces of assembled relatives. "I've observed patterns of behavior choices about character and values and decisions about how we treat the people we claim to love. Today's presentations have crystallized some concerns I've held for years about fairness, recognition, and reward." Dad shifted uncomfortably and attempted to interject. "Mom, this might not be the best time for estate discussions. We're trying to celebrate Daniel's opportunities, and these matters are probably better handled privately." Grandma Rose's response was swift and decisive. "Richard, you've had your opportunity to speak about your priorities and values. Now it's my turn to share mine." Her tone carried a firmness that I'd rarely heard from her, but which commanded immediate respect and attention from everyone present. "I want to tell you all about Sarah's character," she continued, turning slightly to look directly at me. "While her family has been focused on Daniel's potential and future plans, I've been watching Sarah's actual achievements and daily choices. I've seen her build a successful business through her own efforts, maintain financial independence without family support, and demonstrate consistent integrity in both her personal and professional relationships." The validation in her words felt like sunlight after years of living in shadow. Grandma Rose was publicly acknowledging accomplishments that my parents had dismissed as inconsequential, recognizing character traits that had gone unnoticed by the people whose approval I'd sought for decades. I've also watched Sarah provide care and attention to family members without expecting recognition or reward. Grandma Rose said, her voice growing warmer as she continued. "She visits me every Sunday afternoon, remembers details about my health and interests, and treats me like a person worth knowing rather than an obligation to fulfill. These visits have been the highlight of my weeks for the past 2 years. Several relatives nodded in recognition of this information, though I realized that many of them probably hadn't known about my regular visits with Grandma Rose. These Sunday afternoons had felt private and personal, not like achievements worth publicizing or credit worth claiming. In contrast, Grandma Rose continued, her tone becoming more pointed. I've watched Daniel cycle through numerous business ventures with family financial support, each time promising success and each time requiring additional resources when reality failed to match projections. I've observed a pattern of dependence disguised as entrepreneurship and entitlement presented as ambition. The criticism of Daniel was delivered with surgical precision, acknowledging his charm and potential, while directly addressing the pattern of failure that everyone had observed but nobody had been willing to name explicitly. Daniel's face had gone pale, and he appeared to be struggling with how to respond to this unexpected assessment of his character and choices. Most importantly, Grandma Rose said, returning her attention to the broader audience, I've watched how this family treats its members based on gender birth order and assumptions about who deserves support versus who should provide it. Today's announcements have confirmed patterns that I've been concerned about for years. She paused for a moment, allowing her words to settle over the room before delivering what I sensed would be the crucial information that had prompted this unexpected speech. 3 weeks ago, I finalized a new will that reflects my own values about character achievement and family loyalty. She announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone delivering information that would reshape everyone's understanding of family dynamics and future planning. I'm leaving my entire estate valued at approximately $2.7 million to my granddaughter Sarah, she said clearly and deliberately. This includes my house, my investment accounts, my life insurance policies, and all personal property. Sarah will inherit everything because she has demonstrated the character integrity and genuine care that I value most in family relationships. The room erupted in shocked silence, followed by hushed conversations as relatives processed this stunning revelation. The amount was more than double what my parents had given Daniel. But more significantly, it represented a complete reversal of the family hierarchy that had been established over decades of favoritism and assumption. I felt like the world had shifted on its axis. Grandma Rose wasn't just providing financial support, she was publicly validating my worth and character in ways that felt almost too overwhelming to absorb. After 32 years of coming second, I was being recognized as the grandchild who had earned her respect and trust. I want to be very clear about my reasoning. Grandma Rose continued, addressing the stunned audience with unwavering confidence. This decision isn't about punishment or favoritism, but about rewarding the values and behaviors that I believe should be encouraged and supported. Sarah has earned this recognition through years of consistent character and genuine care. The immediate aftermath of Grandma Rose's announcement created chaos that was both exhilarating and terrifying. My parents looked as though they'd been struck by lightning, their faces cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and growing anger as they processed the implications of what they'd just heard. Dad was the first to recover enough to attempt a response, though his words came out as more of a sputter than coherent speech. Mom, this can't be. You can't just make decisions like this without discussing them with the family. This affects everyone, and Sarah certainly doesn't need that kind of money when Daniel is just trying to get established. His objection revealed the depth of his inability to understand that Grandma Rose's decision was based on merit, rather than need, character, rather than assumption and careful observation, rather than automatic favoritism. Even faced with explicit criticism of his own choices, Dad continued to operate under the assumption that Daniel deserved support regardless of his track record. Mom's response was more emotional and direct. Rose, this is going to tear our family apart. You can't reward Sarah for being selfish and independent while punishing Daniel for needing family support. This isn't fair to anyone, and it's certainly not fair to the family relationships we've all worked to maintain. The irony of Mom accusing me of selfishness while simultaneously arguing that I should be punished for independence was breathtaking in its lack of self-awareness. She was essentially arguing that my success and self-sufficiency made me less deserving of recognition than Daniel's repeated failures and ongoing dependence. Daniel himself seemed to be struggling with how to respond to this complete reversal of his fortunes and expectations. The afternoon had begun with him as the celebrated recipient of substantial family investment and public recognition of his potential. Now he was facing the reality that the family member he'd always overshadowed had been chosen by his grandmother as the inheritor of an even larger fortune. "Grandma Rose," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of hurt and confusion, "I don't understand why you're doing this now at this moment. If you had concerns about family dynamics, couldn't we have discussed them privately, rather than making these announcements in front of everyone?" His question revealed his continued inability to grasp that the public nature of both announcements was precisely the point. Grandma Rose had witnessed my parents' public humiliation of me and had chosen to respond with an equally public validation of my worth and character. Several relatives attempted to mediate what was rapidly becoming a family crisis of unprecedented proportions. Uncle Frank suggested that perhaps everyone needed time to process these unexpected developments before making any hasty statements or decisions. Aunt Margaret proposed that the estate planning discussions should be handled separately from the celebration of Daniel's business opportunity. But Grandma Rose wasn't finished with her revelations or her assessment of family dynamics. She had clearly prepared for this moment and intended to address all aspects of the situation that had prompted her decision. "I want everyone to understand that this decision has been years in the making," she said, her voice remaining steady, despite the emotional chaos erupting around her. "This isn't a reaction to today's announcements, though they certainly confirmed concerns I've held about how this family recognizes and rewards character." She went on to describe specific observations she'd made over the years. Daniel's pattern of requesting financial support followed by business failures. My parents' consistent dismissal of my achievements while celebrating his potential and the broader family's acceptance of these dynamics as normal and appropriate. "I've watched Sarah work 60-hour weeks to build her business while Daniel received free rent and spending money," Grandma Rose said, her voice carrying a sharp edge of disapproval. "I've seen Sarah purchase her own home through careful saving and planning while Daniel had his credit card debts paid off repeatedly by his parents." These specific examples created uncomfortable recognition among family members who had witnessed these patterns but had never seen them articulated so directly. The favoritism that everyone had observed but avoided discussing was being laid bare in ways that made denial impossible. "Most importantly," Grandma Rose continued, "I've watched how Sarah treats people when she has nothing to gain from the relationship. She visits me because she enjoys my company, not because she expects inheritance. She helps neighbors and friends without keeping score or seeking recognition. She builds business relationships based on integrity rather than manipulation." This character assessment felt like the most profound gift Grandma Rose could have given me. For the first time in my adult life, someone was publicly acknowledging not just my achievements, but the values and character traits that had guided my decisions and actions over the years. The room had become increasingly tense as relatives processed the implications of Grandma Rose's decision and the family conflict it had created. Some appeared supportive of her choice, nodding in recognition of the character traits she'd described. Others seemed concerned about the family division that would inevitably result from such a dramatic redistribution of expected inheritance. What struck me most during this surreal experience was the realization that Grandma Rose had not only chosen to support me financially, but had also chosen to do so in a way that directly addressed the public humiliation I'd experienced earlier in the afternoon. Her announcement wasn't just about money, it was about justice, recognition, and the correction of decades of misplaced priorities. As the initial shock began to wear off, and family members started attempting to navigate this new reality, I found myself feeling a mixture of gratitude, vindication, and overwhelming responsibility. Grandma Rose had given me not just financial security, but public validation of my worth and character. The question now was how to honor that gift while managing the inevitable family consequences of her decision. The party effectively ended within 30 minutes of Grandma Rose's announcement, though the departure process was awkward and strained as family members struggled to navigate appropriate responses to what they'd witnessed. Some relatives offered quiet congratulations and expressions of support, while others seemed uncertain about how to acknowledge the dramatic shift in family dynamics and financial expectations. My parents' reaction evolved from shock to anger, to what appeared to be strategic planning about how to address this unexpected development. Dad spent several minutes in intense conversation with Daniel, apparently discussing options for challenging or modifying Grandma Rose's decision. Mom oscillated between attempting to comfort Daniel and shooting accusatory glances in my direction, as if I had somehow orchestrated this reversal of fortune. As guests gradually departed, the remaining family members gathered in smaller groups for conversations that felt simultaneously private and performative. Everyone seemed aware that their responses to Grandma Rose's announcement would be remembered and would influence future family relationships, but nobody seemed certain about the appropriate way to navigate such unprecedented circumstances. Grandma Rose herself appeared both exhausted and relieved as she settled back into her comfortable chair near the window. The effort of her public speech and the emotional intensity of confronting decades of family dynamics had clearly drained her energy, but her expression carried a satisfaction that suggested she felt good about finally addressing issues that had concerned her for years. I approached her chair carefully, uncertain about how to express my gratitude and amazement at what she'd done. The magnitude of her gift was overwhelming, but the public nature of her support felt even more meaningful than the financial implications. "Grandma Rose," I said quietly, sitting in the chair beside her, "I don't know what to say. I had no idea you were considering anything like this, and I certainly never expected you to make such a public statement about our family's dynamics." She reached over and patted my hand with the gentle affection that had characterized our Sunday afternoon visits for years. "Sarah, dear," she said softly, "I've been watching and waiting for the right moment to address these issues for longer than you might imagine. Today's announcements made it clear that the time for subtle hints and private conversations had passed." Our conversation was interrupted by Dad's approach, his expression serious and his tone carrying the authority he typically used in business negotiations. "Mom," he said, "I think we need to discuss this estate planning situation privately. These kinds of major financial decisions affect the entire family, and they shouldn't be made without consultation and consideration of everyone's needs and circumstances." Grandma Rose's response was swift and uncompromising. "Richard, I'm 92 years old, and I've had plenty of time to consider everyone's needs and circumstances. My decision is final, and it's based on careful observation of character and values over many years. If you're concerned about fairness, perhaps you should examine your own choices about how you've treated your children." The tension between them was palpable, representing not just disagreement about inheritance, but fundamental differences in values and approaches to family relationships. Dad clearly believed that family financial support should be based on need and potential, while Grandma Rose was insisting that character and demonstrated values were more important considerations. Over the following hour, as the house gradually emptied of guests, several relatives made points of speaking with me privately about Grandma Rose's announcement. The reactions were mixed but generally more supportive than I'd expected, with several family members expressing that they'd observed the same patterns of favoritism that Grandma Rose had described. Uncle Mike pulled me aside to say that he'd always been impressed by my work ethic and business success, and that he thought Grandma Rose's decision reflected good judgment about character and values. Aunt Carol mentioned that she'd noticed how differently my parents treated Daniel and me, and that she was glad to see me finally receiving the recognition I deserved. These conversations helped me realize that the family dynamics I'd experienced weren't invisible to other relatives, but that most people had felt it wasn't their place to comment on parenting choices or inheritance decisions. Grandma Rose's public announcement had given them permission to acknowledge patterns they'd observed for years, but had never felt comfortable discussing. The most difficult conversation occurred when Daniel approached me as I was preparing to leave. His earlier confidence had been replaced by a vulnerability I rarely saw from him, and his words carried a mixture of hurt confusion and what appeared to be genuine concern about our relationship. "Sarah," he said hesitantly, "I want you to know that I never intended for today to turn out like this. I didn't know that Dad was going to say those things about you, and I certainly didn't expect Grandma Rose to make such a dramatic response. I hope this doesn't permanently damage our relationship as siblings. His apology felt sincere, though it also revealed his continued inability to recognize his own role in the family dynamics that had led to this moment. He was treating the situation as an unfortunate series of events, rather than the logical consequence of years of choices about character effort and family loyalty. "Daniel," I replied carefully, "our relationship doesn't have to be damaged by this, but it does need to be based on mutual respect and recognition of each other's actual worth and contributions. I'm not angry at you for receiving financial support, but I'm hurt by the family's assumption that I deserve less consideration because I've been successful independently." As I drove home that evening, I found myself processing not just the financial implications of Grandma Rose's gift, but the deeper meaning of what she'd done. For the first time in my adult life, I'd experienced being truly seen and valued by someone whose opinion mattered deeply to me. The inheritance was extraordinary, but the public validation of my character felt even more significant. The challenge ahead would be managing the family relationships that had been fundamentally altered by the day's events while honoring Grandma Rose's faith in my character and values. Her gift came with the implicit responsibility to use it wisely and to continue demonstrating the qualities that had earned her recognition and support. The weeks following the party brought a complex mixture of family reconciliation attempts, legal consultations, and personal reflection as everyone processed the implications of Grandma Rose's announcement. The initial shock gradually gave way to practical concerns about inheritance timelines, tax implications, and the ongoing dynamics between family members who now found themselves in dramatically different financial situations. My parents' response evolved from anger to strategic acceptance as they consulted with attorneys and financial advisors about the legal realities of Grandma Rose's estate planning. The will was properly executed, witnessed, and legally binding, leaving them with limited options for challenging her decision, even if they'd been inclined to pursue such a course. More importantly, several conversations with extended family members apparently helped them understand that their treatment of Daniel and me had been more obviously unfair than they'd realized. Aunt Margaret and Uncle Robert both reported having frank discussions with my parents about favoritism patterns they'd observed over the years, providing outside perspective that forced Mom and Dad to confront their own choices and assumptions. These conversations led to a series of awkward but necessary family meetings, where we attempted to address the underlying issues that had created the crisis. Dad eventually acknowledged that his announcement at the party had been harsher than necessary, and that he'd failed to recognize my business achievements adequately. Mom admitted that she'd allowed her concern for Daniel's struggles to overshadow her appreciation for my independence and success. Daniel's adjustment to the new family dynamics was more complex and ongoing. The loss of his expected inheritance was significant, but the public nature of Grandma Rose's criticism of his character appeared to have prompted genuine self-reflection about his patterns of dependence and failure to follow through on commitments. To his credit, Daniel used the $1.3 million gift from our parents more thoughtfully than his previous business ventures had suggested he might. Instead of immediately launching into real estate development, he enrolled in business management courses, consulted with successful developers about market realities, and spent several months researching opportunities without making hasty financial commitments. The most meaningful change in our family relationships came from Daniel's acknowledgement that his assumption of automatic financial support had been unfair to me and unhealthy for his own development. During one particularly honest conversation, he admitted that receiving constant family funding had prevented him from developing the persistence and problem-solving skills that business success required. "I've been thinking about what Grandma Rose said about character and values," he told me during a coffee meeting 2 months after the party. "I realize that I've been so focused on big ideas and potential that I haven't paid attention to the daily work and consistency that actually build successful businesses. Watching you manage your design firm has shown me what real entrepreneurship looks like." These acknowledgments felt more valuable than any apology could have been, representing genuine recognition of different approaches to work success and family responsibility. Our relationship began developing into something more mutual and respectful than the sibling dynamic we'd maintained throughout our adult years. Grandma Rose herself seemed energized by the changes her announcement had created within our family. Our Sunday afternoon visits continued, but with a new dimension of satisfaction as she observed the positive effects of her decision to address long-standing issues directly, rather than hoping they would resolve themselves naturally. I've been waiting years for this family to have honest conversations about fairness and character, she told me during one of our tea sessions. Sometimes it takes dramatic action to force people to examine assumptions they've never questioned. I'm glad I lived long enough to see these changes beginning to happen. The practical aspects of inheriting Grandma Rose's estate required significant learning about financial management, investment strategies, and tax planning. I worked with attorneys and financial advisors to understand my new responsibilities and opportunities, discovering that Grandma Rose had been remarkably thoughtful about diversifying her investments and planning for tax-efficient wealth transfer. More importantly, I began using some of the inheritance to expand my design business in ways that created opportunities for other people, rather than just personal wealth accumulation. I hired additional staff, invested in better equipment and software, and began offering internships and mentorship programs for young designers trying to establish their careers. These choices reflected values that Grandma Rose had recognized and wanted to support, using success as a platform for helping others building businesses based on quality and integrity, rather than quick profits, and recognizing that true wealth includes the ability to make positive impacts on other people's lives. The inheritance also provided financial security that allowed me to take creative risks and pursue projects based on interest rather than immediate profitability. I began accepting pro bono work for nonprofit organizations, developed educational workshops about design and entrepreneurship, and invested time in community projects that utilized my skills for public benefit. 6 months after the party, our family relationships had stabilized into new patterns that felt more honest and sustainable than previous dynamics. My parents' relationship with Daniel became more balanced, providing emotional support, while requiring him to demonstrate progress and responsibility before receiving additional financial assistance. Their relationship with me evolved to include genuine curiosity about my work and recognition of my achievements that had been absent for decades. The most profound change was in my own sense of self-worth and family belonging. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly seen and valued for my actual character and contributions, rather than compared unfavorably to assumptions about what I should be providing or achieving. Grandma Rose's gift had been more than financial. It had been recognition that transformed my understanding of my own value and potential. The experience taught me that sometimes the most loving thing family members can do is to address dysfunction directly, rather than hoping it will improve naturally over time. Grandma Rose's willingness to create temporary conflict in service of long-term honesty had ultimately strengthened our family relationships in ways that years of polite avoidance had failed to achieve. Looking back on that transformative afternoon, I realized that the most important inheritance hadn't been money or property, but the knowledge that being truly seen and valued is possible when you encounter people who share your values and recognize your worth. Sometimes the family that chooses us proves more important than the family we were born into, and sometimes it takes courage to accept love and recognition when they finally appear. Have you ever felt like the overlooked child in your family while watching a sibling receive all the attention and support? I'd love to hear about your experiences with family favoritism in the comments below. Please hit that like button if this story resonated with your own struggles for recognition and validation. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family dysfunction and finding your true worth. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their value isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. Thank you for listening to my story, and for understanding that sometimes the greatest inheritance is simply being recognized for who you truly are. I hope you find the courage to value yourself even when others fail to see your worth, and remember that the right people will always appreciate your genuine character and contributions.